So again, today we're going to talk about legislation passed during the Roosevelt term. And what I mean by that was from the time that Roosevelt died until his term would have ended. Remember, Harry S. Truman was only in office as vice president 82 days before Roosevelt died. So there was a lot of time in which we consider the rest of Roosevelt's fourth term. And so these are some of the pieces of legislation that were passed. Now some of these Truman supported and some of these maybe he didn't, okay? But you've got to remember that there was a Republican-controlled Congress during the time that Truman served the rest of Roosevelt's term. It's not always easy to get anything done when the Congress is controlled by the party opposite of what you are. But anyway, there were some four important pieces of legislation that were passed through Congress during the time that Truman served out the rest of Roosevelt's term. The first one was called the GI Bill of Rights. What do you think that had to do with, Josh? GI Bill of Rights.
Servicemen and the rights they had after war.
Absolutely correct. The GI Bill of Rights were servicemen and rights they would have after they came back from war. And basically what the law did is it provided benefits for veterans who returned from war. Provided benefits for veterans who had returned from war. Now, if you were returning from war, Andy Denise, what benefit might you want that you wouldn't have otherwise?
Money to go to school.
There we go. Okay, so now as hard as this might be to believe, they gave government loans and provided government money for veterans not only to just attend college, but some of them did not get through high school because of the war effort. So it supplied government money to help returning GI veterans complete their high school diplomas and then go on to college. We still have a version of that today, do we not? If you go into the military right now, they have a program that when you get done, they'll pay for your schooling. The Army just started a new program last year in which you can do your schooling while you're in the Army because of the online possibility. So it continues today that veterans that come back from serving our country will have some benefits concerning education. Now it's more college-based because you know in those days, and even when I was in high school, you didn't have to have a high school diploma to go to the military. Matter of fact, if you were kind of a loser, so to speak, oftentimes your guidance counselor would say, you know, you're not worth a darn. You're not doing very good, great kid. Go talk to the Army recruiter. He'll fix you right up. And they would. Now you have to have a high school diploma to get in the service, or an equivalency. So it's a lot different. Okay, so kids today go and get their college degrees on the GI Bill. In those days, some of them even got their high school diplomas. Okay, what might be another benefit, Charles, you would want if you came back from war? What might you want that you couldn't otherwise get, probably?
Jobs?
Well, a job's going to tie in with the education to get you a job, okay? But what else might you need?
A house.
Yeah, you might want to buy a house. You got any money? No. So what it did is it gave low-interest government loans so veterans could purchase homes. They were called a VA loan. Usually really low interest. And there were two benefits to the veteran to get a VA loan. The obvious benefit would be what? They could afford to buy a house because they're going to loan them this money at a really low rate. But you know what? If you got your feet on the ground and he gets this house he bought on the VA loan and he wants to buy another house, he could sell his house and whoever bought it, veteran or not, could assume his VA low interest loan. So sometimes that's a good way to buy a house, is find a VA loan that's really low interest that somebody got. That was another benefit for veterans. Not only could they purchase a house, but they also could sell the house maybe easier if they want to, because the person could assume their VA loan. Okay, what else might you want money for? Well, maybe. What else might you want money for? You're going to come back and maybe you want to start your own business. Or you might want
That's
to
a family too.
start your own family. That goes along with the house. But you might want to start your own business. Or you might want to go into farming. So it provided low-interest government loans to help people get on their feet to start a business or to maybe go into a farming situation, agricultural deal. So, Government loans for veterans to purchase homes. Government loans for veterans to start a business or a farm. Government money for veterans to attend high school or college. What else might, and I don't think we do a very good job even today of doing this, what else should a veteran get if he serves his country? Well, we talk about the college, you get a job. What? What did somebody else say? What should you get if you served your country? What? Health care, very good. So the GI Bill of Rights also provided health care for veterans. You know why a lot of teachers stay teaching longer than maybe they should? Because they can't afford the insurance, health care. So in a school district like ours, the school district pays a large part of the premium, we pay a small part of the premium. If I had to go out, I probably pay $200 a month, I'm guessing, for my health insurance for my wife and I. If I quit my job and had to buy my own health insurance, it'd probably be $1,400 a month. So people, health insurance is a big deal. These veterans came back and they had none. And so the government helped them with that. And a final thing they helped them with is what should you get after, what am I going to get after I retire from education? I'm going to get a pension, right? And the government provided pensions for veterans. It came back, they would receive a pension for the rest of their life, depending on what? Length of service and rank. Okay? Length of service and rank. So the GI Bill of Rights was a good thing to have. It was a good piece of legislation that was passed during the Roosevelt term when President Truman served out the rest of that term. GI Bill of Rights. Okay? Another piece of legislation that was passed during this time was the National Security Act of 1947. The National Security Act of 1947. Now, what did we call, I'm trying to say this without giving it away. We have President's Cabinet, right? We talked about establishing the President's Cabinet way back in Washington. And he had a Department of the Treasury, and he had a Department of State. What else did he have? A Department of War. It's been called the Department of War since the Washington presidency to this point. What this particular law did, the National Security Act of 1947, is it created what we know today as the Department of Defense. And it supplied us with the Secretary of Defense and gave the Secretary of Defense three assistants to help him run the Department of Defense. So the National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense as we know it today. It used to be the Department of War. It established a Secretary of Defense and then gave that Secretary of Defense three assistants to help him run the defense of this country. You know what his assistants were? Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Force. So it also created three new departments in the military. The Department of the Army, the Department of the Air Force, the Department of the Navy, and it created a secretary of each.
Isn't it James Maddox? No. Mad Dog Maddox now?
Mad Dog Maddox is the Secretary of Defense, yeah? But he has assistants bigger than this, that's even branched higher. But this would give the Secretary of Defense the Secretary of the Navy to work on Navy, Secretary of the Air Force to work on Air Force, and Secretary of the Army to work on the Army. You know the Marines actually serve under? Which? The Navy. Yeah. U.S. Marines are under the Navy. Okay? All right. The next piece of legislation we've talked about already, and that was the 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution. 22nd Amendment to the United States Constitution, which did limit the number of terms that a president can serve as two elected terms. Okay, it limited the number of presidential terms at two elected. So we mentioned Harry Truman, right? He only served 82 days as vice president, then took over as president. So he's going to serve all the rest of Roosevelt's term. He's going to be elected in 48. We'll talk about that today. And he could have been elected in 52, but he could not have run in 56. Okay? So it limited a president to two elected terms. Okay? And the last piece of legislation that was passed was called the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. It's a little confusing, but I'll try to get it in layman's terms. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Now, basically what the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 did was it reduced the power of organized labor. Reduced the power of organized labor. Mr. Lawton, what is organized labor? Okay. But what do they call organized labor? What? U-word. Unions. Okay, organized labor are unions. Okay? You have all kinds of unions. I belong to a union. I belong to the NEA, National Education Association. WEA. Now in Wyoming, unfortunately, it's a right-to-work state, so any unions in Wyoming don't mean much because this government and this state has passed the fact that you will go to work. Okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. So, this law would reduce the power of organized labor. Now here's how the three ways it would do it. Here are the three ways that the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 would reduce the power of organized labor. The first one you hear about today. The first thing that it did is it restricted the amount of money that a union could contribute to... What? Restricted the amount or limited the amount that a labor union could give to who? What type of campaigns? Political campaigns. Because if the NRA dumps a bunch of money into Randy Deer running for Congress, what's the NRA going to expect if I get elected? No gun control, right? So what was happening, these unions were throwing money into these political candidates expecting favors in it. You know, I'll scratch your back a little, you scratch my back a little. So what this Taft-Hartley Act did is it restricted the amount of money that unions could contribute to political campaigns. Are we not talking about that now? They're still talking about organizations, not necessarily unions, but organizations, the limit that any organization can give to a political campaign. I'm going to give you a quick example. It's kind of off the top, but it gives you a good example. There is an initiative in Montana right now called Initiative 185. And what it's set up to do, if passed, is it will tax the devil out of tobacco that's sold in Montana, and all the money from that tax will go to create better health care for the people of Montana. To me, it sounds like a great idea. We're going to take advantage of all the smokers, and we're going to help probably them as well, right? Because of their the tobacco companies have thrown millions of dollars into this little state of Montana to make sure that that initiative does not pass. Because who stands to lose money if it does? Tobacco companies. And the other side, they figured between the two sides, for and against Initiative 185 in Montana, $22 million has been spent. Take the money and give it to health care, right? You see, but that's what they're doing. It was a big issue on the news last night, the amount of money. Well, basically what we're saying here is that we want to restrict the amount of money that we can give, anybody can give to a cause of any kind. Okay? Okay, the second thing that the Taft-Hartley Act did to try to reduce the power of organized labor is they allowed employers to get injunctions against striking employees. It allowed employers to secure injunctions against striking employees. Anybody know what an injunction is? Allowing employers to get injunctions against striking employees. So if you're going to get an injunction against somebody that's striking, so I'm the employer, you're all employees, you're going on strike. I'm going to get an injunction that says you can't. That's a judicial order that says, you know what, Naya, you signed this contract until June 1st, you have no right to walk out and not go to work and strike. Okay? You have to come back to work. So employees were allowed to get judicial orders that required her to come back to work. What if she didn't? Fired her. Okay? Teachers' strikes are probably the best example of this. So what happens is we signed a contract to teach for this year. I signed a contract, I'm making X amount of dollars to teach you kids this year, provide scholarship opportunities, whatever. So all of a sudden I'm halfway through the year and I'm thinking, this is a bunch of BS, I'm not getting enough money. So all of us go on strike and we walk out the door, even though we're under contract, right? And all of you guys are set with no teachers here teaching you, and it causes problems and school's canceled, we got to make it up in June, whatever. Well, what an injunction does, it's a judicial order that they would present to me and say, you know what, buddy? You either get your rear end back in there and you teach those kids, or we're firing you and we'll bring somebody in that will. That's basically what an injunction is. And so to try to reduce the power of these organized labor, they allowed employers to get injunctions to keep their employees from striking. Does that make sense? Okay. The third thing, doesn't make any sense to you now, because now if you want to get a job latent at Pepsi, you got to take a what? You got to take a drug testing. In those days, if you wanted to get a job, employers would force employees to sign non-communist oaths, saying that you were not a communist. And this is what you're going to figure out. Seems silly, but we had a tremendous communist scare in this country from the end of World War II clear up through the 60s, which resulted in something we know as the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, I'm telling you, this communist scare around the country. We went to 2 wars over communism. Korea and Vietnam. Totally over the fact that we did not want a communist country to take over a non-communist country. This was a big issue. And so we didn't want any damn communists in America. And so you had to sign an oath saying you weren't communist. And they ever found out that you had a piece of communist literature in your hand, what would they do? Fire you.
Blacklist you actually.
They'd fire you. So that's what the Taft-Hartley Act did. It tried to reduce the power of organized labor by restricting the amount that unions could contribute to political campaigns, by allowing employers to get injunctions against striking employees, and requiring all employees to sign non-communist oaths. Okay? Now, we're going to move on to the election of 1948, which is quite a mess. And this is where Harry Truman's going to make the decision to try to run for his own term. But we're going to start with the Republican Party and see what they got going. Okay? And then you can tell me who you think has the advantage. First of all, who's controlling Congress? Republicans. Now, I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, now during the election of 1948, the Republican Party really were considering 2 candidates for nomination. They were both good. They really had 2 good choices. The first one we already talked about, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, and if you can remember, he's the one that lost to President Roosevelt by a landslide in his last election of 1944. Maybe you remember that, I'm sure it's in your notes. So Thomas E. Dewey, who was the governor of New York, who had lost to Roosevelt in 1944, was one of the men that the Republican Party was considering as their candidate. Okay? Good choice, really. He just ran at the wrong time. The other person they were looking at was a senator from Ohio by the name of Robert Taft. Robert Taft. And he was probably the most influential Republican in the Senate. They even called him Mr. Republican. Okay? So he was probably the most influential Republican in the Senate. So what they're considering is a very experienced governor of New York, one of the biggest states in the Union, or one of the most prominent Republican senators in the Senate. Now Robert Taft also had a little bit more of a chip in his bag because he was the son of President William Howard Taft. So he had that pedigree, so to speak, that his dad was president, which could be good or bad depending on how you viewed the job that his dad did, right? Okay? We actually will visit William Howard Taft's gravesite in D.C. Only 2 presidents buried in Arlington. Well, when the dust cleared, the Republicans went with New York Governor Thomas Dewey. And they couldn't have gone wrong either way, probably, but they went with Dewey. Now, the man that Dewey picked, ironically, to be his vice presidential running mate was a governor from California by the name of Earl Warren. Ever heard of Earl Warren? Anybody ever heard of Earl Warren? You will later, because he will go on to become the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and will be the man that puts out the investigation on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Warren Commission. Okay, so you'll learn more about him. So Thomas Dewey, governor of New York, is going to run for president on the Republican ticket. His running mate will be California Governor Earl Warren. Now, before the campaign even started, and we haven't even got to the Democrats yet, the Republicans are confident of victory for several reasons. One would be post-war problems. Anytime you're the president after a war, you got problems. The economy was bad, right? So those are two reasons why the Republicans thought, well, gee whiz, we'll probably win this election, because the economy's bad, we have post-war problems, and who controls the Congress? Republicans. Now, there's another little issue I'm going to talk about here. Harry Truman had a devil of a time getting anything passed during those final years of Roosevelt's term because we had a Republican-controlled Congress. And he's going to use that against the Republicans in this election we'll talk about later. But let's move on to the Democrats. First of all, the Democratic Party is in serious disarray. It's all split up. Too many different philosophies, okay? And this is going to be really painful to hear. So, when they go into the Democratic National Convention to pick a candidate, there is just an unbelievable split among the Democratic Party, okay? Southern Democrats, who were very unhappy with the issue of civil rights for blacks, formed a new political party called the States' Rights Party. Anytime you have political parties splitting off and forming within your own party, are you at the advantage or disadvantage? Huge disadvantage. So Southern Democrats were very unhappy because they thought that civil rights for blacks was happening too fast. And they formed a new political party called the States' Rights Party. And we get a move to the wall for the first time, kiddos. And they nominate this fella right here, J. Strom Thurmond, for president. And J. Strom Thurmond was a governor, at the time he was the governor of South Carolina. This man will go on to serve in the Senate longer than any man in American history.
He was at what, 2002 or 3?
God, I don't remember, but he was in his 90s.
I had him for